Welcome to the Veteran Action Update Brief. I'm Mark Lucas, founder of Veteran Action. Our guest is former Air Force Major Kacy Dixon. She was an intelligence officer and served in the JAG Corps. She refused the COVID-19 vaccine and voluntarily left the military. Kacy has been an outspoken advocate seeking justice for our service members impacted by the vaccine mandate. She was recently at the Pentagon to help Secretary Hegseth change this policy. Kacy, Secretary Hegseth recently said that Joe Biden issued unlawful orders. You being a lawyer and former JAG officer, can you explain why these orders were unlawful?
Yeah, of course. Thank you for having me here, Mark. And um, I'd like to address kind of a breadth of things. In August and September of 2021, Joe Biden issued Executive Orders 14042 and 14043, which mandated the COVID vaccine for federal employees and for federal contractors. So those were the issues, the orders that President Biden specifically issued. My focus has been on the DoD mandate that was issued by Secretary Austin at the time. But I want to make it clear that the same body of law that I'm going to be discussing applies equally across the board to all of these categories of people, and in fact apply to all U.S. citizens. So the biggest issue with the mandate, and there were really two within the DoD, one being the experimental nature of these products, and two being the religious accommodation process. So at its inception, this mandate was unlawful as implemented, and that's the language that Secretary Hegseth has used in his memo announcing the unlawfulness of these, and that's important, and here's why. When Secretary Austin issued his memo in August of 2021 mandating these vaccines, he wrote it to be technically, legally accurate. And that memo specifically stated that DoD service members would only be mandated to take FDA-approved doses of the product, and that doses that were issued under emergency use authorization would only be received on a voluntary basis. Now, the reason that it was written that way is because legally it had to be, and here's why. Military members and all U.S. citizens cannot be mandated to take experimental drugs. They cannot be made to take products that are not FDA approved. So while the FDA had come out in August of 2021 issuing FDA approval, that just gives the manufacturing companies approval to go forth and manufacture doses that comply with all of the requirements of the application that those companies submit. So FDA said, company, go forward and manufacture these products, but Pfizer never manufactured those doses for the entire duration of the military. DoD service members only had access to experimental EUA doses. And I want to make a distinction here. There is a provision of law that allows, and it's unique to military members, where the President of the United States can issue a waiver of service members' informed consent rights, essentially making them take experimental products if certain statutory requirements are met. Now, it's arguable whether those conditions were met. I don't think that they were, but even if they had been, no such waiver of informed consent rights was ever issued. So DoD service members always retained the right to informed consent, which includes the opportunity to accept or refuse the product without consequence. So that was the key issue, and this was actually something that was litigated. I was involved in litigation over this very issue, and the federal judge in that case, I guess, reasserted what we already knew from anthrax litigation, which is you have to be provided a product that is actually FDA approved. It doesn't matter if they're chemically similar. It doesn't matter if they're chemically identical. The product actually has to be FDA approved. And the reason for that is because the safety and efficacy of EUA doses is significantly less. There's a much lower threshold for safety and efficacy of EUA doses. And additionally, because you're presumptively being given informed consent, you're assuming the risk. You are essentially waiving all liability of the manufacturers of that product because you're saying, I know that there's no guarantees of the safety and efficacy of this product, and I'm with informed consent, knowing all of the potential outcomes, I'm electing to take this. But that is not the process that played out within the DoD. So.
And I mentioned earlier that you're at the Pentagon. Can you explain the purpose of that meeting and what Secretary Hegseth is doing to help revise this policy?
Yes. So Jordan Carr, who has been a huge advocate in this movement, Davis Younts, who is also a former Air Force JAG, he's a attorney now. He and Jordan and I went to the Pentagon. We were invited by a senior DoD official who I think was just genuinely interested in understanding our experiences, our perspectives, and wanted our input for what blind spots they might have. And he was very, very forthcoming in saying, the policy that is about to go out is not going to cut it. He knew, we know that there are things that we're not seeing. Obviously, they're handling tons of different issues up there. Whereas, our group has been almost exclusively focused on the COVID issue. So he was really reaching out to tap into kind of the expertise that we have. He was very open-minded and genuinely just wanted policy input from those who've been impacted. So I think that was his goal. Our goal was to ensure that the scope of this issue was known. So, in some of the initial, public media accounts that President Trump put out, he talked about kind of there's the 8,700 number that's thrown around of people who were involuntarily discharged and kicked out of service. But there are tens of thousands more who voluntarily left, and I use that term loosely because really there was a huge coercion where it was under threat of, you're going to be punished, you're going to get a downgraded discharge characterization if you don't voluntarily separate, which can equal loss of benefits. So there was a huge purge of tens of thousands of more over the mandate. And then additionally, there are still people in service who refuse the vaccine, but managed to not get discharged. Their careers have been thrown off of trajectory in terrible ways. Missing opportunities to sit at promotion boards, negative paperwork that impacted their careers, loss of flight hours for pilots, things like that. And then included in the scope as well are people who took this shot, who were coerced into taking it, and who are suffering moral injury from that, who feel duped now that they understand that this was unlawful. And it has to be stated, those who took this and are now vaccine injured. So when we talk about this issue, we're not talking about 8,700 who were kicked out. We are talking about thousands, tens of thousands, potentially into the over hundreds of thousands of people who need remedy after what has happened under the last administration.
I was a member of the Iowa Army National Guard when the COVID-19 mandate occurred, and I told my senior ranking officer that I'm not saying no to the vaccine. How about just no right now? Because I knew that this was going to be litigated, and they sat me down anyway and said, Lucas, nope, you have to take it now. I believe it was like in February, and I believe that it was going to be litigated over the summer. And I remember, I was on the fast track of promotion to become a battalion commander. I deployed to Afghanistan. I volunteered to go to South Korea at the height of the tensions with North Korea. I was the type of officer you wanted to keep in the military. And they sat me down, they formally counseled me, and they made me watch a CDC propaganda video, which at the time I knew half the stuff was false, but they made me do it anyway. And I didn't leave the military solely for that purpose, but there were a lot of us where that left a really bad taste in our mouth, and it just expedited our decision to leave. So Kacy, what can the Pentagon or Congress do to ensure something like this never happens again?
Well, so I get this question a lot, and the first thing that I say is follow the law. That would have mitigated nearly all of the growth out of this. So I think there are a lot of people who want to help. There are a lot of initiatives that are going forward. If we followed the existing laws and policies, these issues would not have arisen in the first place. So that is where I would start. And you, having been in the military, understand that we do an after action report after almost everything that we do. This mandate affected tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of lives and livelihoods. It ruined careers. Multiple laws were violated. So there needs to be an investigation into all of this, and there needs to be an after action report that clearly shows who knew what, when did they know it, and who was making these decisions. Those of us who've been intimately involved in this, we understand that people knowingly violated the law, and there has to be accountability. That is the number one thing. Follow the law, investigate the laws that were broken, and hold people accountable for their knowing violations of the law. So that is where I would start. When we move on to, other things longer term, one of the huge things that's recently been said is, and I don't know if you had an opportunity to see Senator Johnson's hearing yesterday on kind of the COVID vaccines and that kind of thing, but there is a real concern that there are huge amounts of vaccine injuries that are being swept under the rug. We did have whistleblowers who brought forward Department of Defense data showing huge spikes in neurological issues, in heart issues. These are things that are now admitted and known to be caused by this vaccine. And so I would say including the COVID-19 vaccinations under the PACT Act as a toxic exposure is something that Congress can and should look at. So those are just a couple of the things, but I don't think that full remedy and accountability can take place until investigations are initiated, and that should happen immediately.
Well, that's a very good summary of what's happened in the past, what Secretary Hegseth and the DoD is doing, and what we need to do moving forward. So, Kacy Dixon, thank you so much for joining the Veteran Action Update Brief.
Thank you for having me, Mark.